Hmm. Where did it go? It was active. Anyway, since I can, yeah, since I can just go and find it again. Hmm. Here. Yeah. So this is Elon Musk famous interview question.
My interview question is always the same. It's
What'd you
just,
ask?
I said, tell me the story of your life and the decisions that you made along the way and why you made them. And then, and also tell me about some of the most difficult problems you worked on and how you solved them. And that question I think is very important because the people that really solve the problem, they know exactly how they solved it. They know the little details. And the people that pretended to solve the problem, they can maybe go one level and then they get stuck.
Okay.
Welcome to the Late Show. I'm your host, Stephen Colbert. Welcome.
All right. So this is agency as a story, and like based on the reading that I'm going to offer today, we can say this is a description of a kind of an intrusive masculine agency. And yeah, masculine here is describes, of course, is not limited to, it's not a biological characterization. It describes a modality, okay? So an intrusive masculine agency where the question is always the same, he says. So there is some kind of formula there. And that formula somehow generates or begets more formulas, right? It expects formulas. It expects answers in the form of a formula, right? So tell me the story. So that would be the formula of your life, decisions you made and why you made them. So the story would imply, of course, there is some causal connection between events. There is a timeline, and there are discrete situations and discrete selves. So the present self can look at the past self, and somehow, yes, those selves are not communicating in any way. They're not influencing one another, right? So the present self can have this be somehow omniscient with regard to the past self, and omnipotent. And then difficult problems you worked on, he says, and how you solved them. So formulas feed on perceived or imagined problems, right? On hypothesis. So somehow for his interview to work, people have to set themselves or position themselves like against some kind of problem. There has to be some problem. And even if there isn't one, we somehow have to invent it. And his assessment would be that there are those who really solve the problem, like he said, right? They control every aspect. There is this assumption that you not only control every aspect of the situation, but you also are in the position to know every aspect of the situation, which is, yeah, another form of control, right? This knowledge. And another form would be your ability to verbalize, right? To formulate it linguistically in an exhaustive way. That's also part of this. That's also an assumption here. And those who pretend they solve the problem, so they do not really control every aspect of the situation, but just pretend that they actually do. So this is agency as one kind of story, let's say. And then we can look at agency as another kind of story. It could be another kind of story. So yeah, the passage that also Paul and I use in our article is 1126, the famous passage where Confucius asks a group of his disciples, what would you do if you had power? And you have Zilu, Ranyou, and Gong Xihua, and finally Zheng Xi giving their different answers. And we're describing this as a gradual, let's say, weakening of agency, starting with Zilu, whose agency is the hardest, somehow the most masculine, and gradually moving to softer and softer and more, let's say, feminine agency until we reach Zheng Xi, Dian, right? So Zilu hastily replied, let's say there is a state of 10,000 chariots between other large states, say it's suffering from invading armies. Now, let's say on top of that, it also suffers from famine in corn and in all kinds of food. If I was given power to govern, in 3 years, I could make the people bold and responsible. And the master smiled at him. Turning to Ranyou, he said, Chiu, what are your wishes? Chiu replied, let's say there is a state of 60 or 70 li square, or one of 60 or 50 or 60, and I have the power to govern it. In 3 years, I could make people prosper. As to the principles of propriety and music, I would have to wait for the rise of a man to do that. What are your wishes? Zhi, said the master to Gong Xihua. Zhi replied, I'm not saying that I'm capable enough for these things, but I would like to learn them. At the services of the ancestral temple and at the audiences of the princes with the sovereign, I would like to wear the dark square-made robe and the black linen cap and serve as a small assistant. And finally, the master asked Zheng Xi, Dian, what are your wishes? Tian, who had been playing his lute, stopped, and while the strings were still twanging, he put the lute aside and said, my wishes are different from those of these 3 gentlemen. The master said, what's wrong with that? Go on, say what you wish to. Tian then said, in the late spring, when the light robes of the season are ready, together with 5 or 6 grown men who have started wearing the cap, and 6 or 7 boys, I would wash in the Yi River, enjoy the breeze in the rain altars, and come back home singing. The master sighed and said, I am with Tian. When the 3 left, Zheng Xi stayed behind and asked, what do you think about their responses? The master said, they just said what they wanted. Xi continued, Master, why did you smile at Yo? Confucius said, the management of a state demands the rules of propriety. His words were not humble. That's why I smiled at him. Xi said again, but wasn't it a state that Zhou imagined for himself? The reply was, yes. Did you ever see a territory of 60 or 70 li or one of 50 or 60, which was not a state? Once more, she asked, and was it not a state which Zhi imagined for himself? The master again replied, yes. Who else but princes have to do with ancestral temples and with audiences but the sovereign? If Zhi was just a small assistant in these ceremonies, who would be the great one? So here we have Confucius praising Dian, and whose agency we could describe as diffused and feminine. The question, again, if we somehow make a comparison, right? If these two compare these 2 interviews, right? Musk's interview and Confucius's interview, quote unquote. So the question is the same again, right? It's the same for all of them. Of course, it's not so specific. It's framed to make them. But it is still
Dimitra, you just cut out for a few seconds.
Oh, okay. So Confucius is asking them to tell him the story of their future life. He's not even asking about the past life. So we might even say that here Confucius is asking more, right? His question is more difficult, more demanding than Musk's question for, let's say, the prospective hiring. It's about decision you will make and why you will make them. But still, this question seems it's also arguable to say that it is non-intrusive compared to Musk's more intrusive question, which asks for all these details and asks for descriptions of like very intricate psychological realities, right? So yeah, in this sense, we might say that Confucius's question is less intrusive. It's just more open. What would you do if you had the power, since you are constantly complaining that you don't have the power? So Confucius's question is also somehow a response to their attitude, to their complaints. It doesn't come out of the blue. And his assessment would be, right, he would characterize those who assume they can understand and fix the world. And he, like his response basically is his silence or his smile to that. Kind of, we might say, condescending smile or a tolerant smile to people's presumptuousness. And he would commend those who allow the world somehow to fix itself, right? Like the ends attitude. So Musk's assessment, who would he hire, right? So Lou says, I could make the people bold and responsible. So for Musk, he would really solve the problem. And he also articulated the problem in the most detailed way. And Ranyo, I could make people prosper. I would have to wait for the rise of a superior man to order the state. So he would be the one who pretends he solved the problem, since he somehow delegates, right, the solution to future, let's say, to somebody who will take over. And then Kong Xihua, I'm not capable for these things, but I want to learn. I'll be a small assistant. Again, I think that Musk might say that he pretends he solved the problem by, by minimizing, right, the weight of his influence, and in a way, by delegating. And then Zheng Xi, I would go with existing norms. So Zheng Xi is the one who does not offer a formula to the quest, right, for a formula. So he resorts to norms, and he somehow evades the question. He does not imagine a problematic situation. He does not construct a hypothesis or a hypothetical problematic situation to which he would respond, right? So he's, I don't think he would be Musk's choice. And what about Kunz's assessment? Well, I think we already know that. Zilu is criticized, right? Indirectly criticized. And after the end, somehow pressures Kunz to respond to that, right? Kunz does not seem willing to go into this kind of assessment. And his first response is, well, they just said what they wanted. But Zheng Xi insists, and Kunz comes up with some indirect or less indirect criticisms, right? So Zilu is not humble. He cannot govern without Li. Basically, it's the same criticism for all of them, that they are not humble enough, with different degrees of lack of humbleness, but equally incompetent of appreciating the role of Li and the importance of cultivating oneself throughly, and also, of course, yeah, governing the self and governing the state, right? 治己 and 治国, like through Li. And then Zheng Xi, right? I would go with existing Li. So he does not really create something new. And instead of going against some perceived problem, he goes along with what is not problematic, with what is already there and which works. So norms and going along with the norms is proposed here instead of formulas. So this we can make this, it is possible, I think, to make this connection here, and also, to find some parallels, but also, of course, to explore how we could identify some differences when it comes to this kind of attitude or to this kind of problem solving, right? Which is problem solving that, like tying, that does not have ropes. And the rope here, we might say, is the fixed and externally imposed solution. 善解无赏约而不可解. So one who is good at tying has no shang, and yet it cannot be untied, right? That's from Chen Guyin's translation. And Paul's translation of Chen Guyin's translation. Someone who is adept at binding does not use a rope, yet no one will be able to untie it. So you have this idea of the ropeless knot. And of course, there is a other story, the Daoist story, which is about solving, about like the, let's say, on the opposite side to the Gordian knot kind of thinking, which is like solving the, not untying the knot by not untying it, right? This kind of solution of no solution. But yes, opposed to that, we can think of Confucius's teachings treated as implements, right? And we can think of, I think there is a way to think of Confucianism and the history of Confucianism, or maybe even the fate of Confucianism, as a gradual masculinization, we could say, especially if we think about Ru as equivalent to Rou. Let's say we could understand Confucianism developing from a kind of softer attitude to the world, right? Or proposing a softer understanding of agency, to harder and harder and institutionalized forms, let's say, of morality. So Confucius's teachings, of course, have been somehow treated or mistreated as implements, right? Like against the 君子不器 kind of thinking, like the 君子 is not a vessel, and Confucius is not a vessel, like somebody who is filled with, let's say, solutions and recipes, right? And maxims and axioms that he can impart, right? Let's say fixed ways of solving or untying knots. And of course, we can see this also in the scholarship, how recently Confucianism has been read as a kind of a fix for different kinds of problems, right? Like Confucianism and AI. Can an AI care robot be filial? Reflections from Confucian ethics. So Confucianism itself somehow becomes this, or is read as this intrusive agent that can, or tool, right? It's a tool that we can implement to solve problems. And that the application of Confucian ideas can produce certain desirable results. So from environmental problems to AI, ethics-related problems, peace, conflict, peace, ethical solutions, Confucian and communitarian responses to liberal democracy, and of course, the article that I mentioned in the beginning itself, that Confucianism can somehow provide a bridge to connect traditional Chinese thought with modern feminist, at least a certain current of feminist thought. So yeah, this is these are the main ideas of this article, Irigaray and Confucius. We tried to reimagine agency through fluidity and ritual. And we proposed this idea, like I said in the beginning, of Confucian diffused agency, which is contextual and which is based on an understanding of morality as relational, which would be parallel to Irigaray's fluid feminine subjectivity. And the two proposals share the critique of atomic individualistic agency, emphasizing fluidity and relationality. So agency emerges through interactions, ritual on the one hand, and Confucianism, and breath on the other, even though Irigaray's study of breath and use of breath and the practices of breath is kind of limited, admittedly. And of course, yeah, we explored the collaboration potential between these two lines of thinking. So Irigaray's feminine fluidity refers to fluid subjectivity, feminine identity as open or as more open, relational, and non-static. And it comes with the critique of phallogocentrism, Western philosophy's exclusion of women's embodied experience, and the philosophy of breath. Breath, like ritual, connects body, spirit, and self and other. And the parallels would be that both reject rigid individualism for embodied situational ethics, and Irigaray's shared air is parallel to Confucian ritual as shared living. Again, if we think of the passage of Dian. So ritual is a framework that guides agency, or out of which agency emerges through contextual norms. For example, the bathing that Dian describes. And we can, of course, connect this understanding, this reading of Confucian agency with Wu Weizhi from the Analects, moral authority through non-coercive influence, right? The Shun or the Yao Shun model of acting. And with I am with Dian. Dian's feminine agency flows with nature, ritual like water. We read in Chu Xi's commentary, 与天地万物上下同流. It contrasts Lu's masculine atomic agency. And here, yeah, if we try to make somehow a comparison, look at the parallels in a more schematic way, the fluid embodied self in Irigaray's work can work together, can collaborate smoothly, we think, with diffuse ritual-based self in early Confucianism, and the critique of atomic autonomy with the rejection of egoistic agency, the intrusive or masculine agency I described in the beginning. Breath as ethical practice on the one hand, and ritual as ethical cultivation, and relational subjectivity with role-based relationality. So, and of course, this agency necessarily, and agency related with the ability, like I said in the beginning, to articulate a story and the story. We can think of story. Yes, I was thinking of the word story, actually. The word story, right, which is related, of course, to history and historia, right, in Greek, historia, which comes from the verb istame, which means to know, right? So agency. So stories about knowledge, like I said in the beginning, but also story as tale and story as fairy tale, right? Again, just making these connections in this kind of stream of conscious way, if you will allow me. So story agency as a story, agency as a tale, a fairy tale, paramythia, paramyth, that is something which is close to myth, right? And which in Greek means comfort. So also agency, right? This kind of reading of agency related to the stories we can tell, the stories we can know, as a comforting, of course, it's very comforting. And this comfort comes with this over-reliance on the formulas, right? The formulas provide this kind of confidence, and this comes with trust in predictable outcomes. And this idea can bring us to the question whether there are Confucian ILOs, right? Intended learning outcomes, as we have to write in our syllabi, in our courses. So this is a question that actually I had to deal with in my own class when I have to explain to students why they should learn. And of course, I can refer to Analects 1.1, where 学 is related to 乐. There is some kind of joy there. But can we think of joy as the outcome of learning? So the agent that decides to set his mind, heart on learning has a guaranteed result, right, in the form of joy? Or is joy something that emerges out of this process, 自然而然, on its own, and it cannot be treated like an outcome, but maybe as a condition of learning? And then Li, of course, related to Le, if we look at the Tian passage, right, and we think about Kong Yan Zhi Le, right, the joy of Kongzi and Yan Hui, which does not come from material comfort, but from these simple joys in life. And so how to justify, right? How to convince students today, and yeah, Paul has a very interesting discussion on the convincing, right? How does Chinese philosophy try to convince you? So how to convince students to set their mind on learning and spend all that time, their minutes, the minutes of their lives, their precious time on learning. Why? So of course, Chinese students, and I think students around the world, are very, very much thinking in a consequentialist way. So learning becomes valuable when it is attached to a certain result, right? A measurable result and a valuable result, a result that is recognized as desirable by society. So how to disengage these two, but without, of course, eliminating the idea of a result, right? Like, so this would be where the Confucianism read as not a version of, right, not as consequential, and not even as a version of consequentialism as it has been proposed by scholars. I think it's not an adequate framework, or even a helpful framework to understand what Confucianism has to offer. So why then, to go back to the simple question, why should students learn? And yeah, how to convince them? So the connection I try to make, or the justification of the way of thinking I try to direct my students to, is to say that you learn because you trust. There is the element of trust, which is somehow beyond justification or before justification. So you trust that something good might come out of this, but you don't know exactly what it is. You don't know if it's going to come out, and you don't know when it is going to come out. So why learn? Why what is the way that Confucian describes it? That he set his mind, right? Why set your mind on the learning? Yeah, again, not because you want to get a particular outcome, or because you are attached to a particular outcome, but because the process itself, and you're focusing on the moment, will be and forgetting about the outcome will be the condition actually for obtaining outcomes. How, when, and what is not so much. It's not so easy to define, but still, yes, it is possible, like to think of these outcomes like in a more, let's say, again, related to agency and to ideas of selfhood and the capacity to understand, or the omnipotence, right, to understand, or the lack thereof of this omnipotence. Yes, it is possible to focus on this without expecting a particular or fixed kind of outcome. Yeah, that's it. These were my thoughts. A little bit, maybe a little bit, yeah, chaotic at some point, but yeah, I tried to just open up also some questions, because I'm also like thinking about these things, and I still don't have like a fixed answers or fixed approaches on how to deal with them. So yeah, I welcome any questions you might have. Like, we can start discussing about this.
Great. Thank you so much. Incredibly exciting. Let's open this up for conversation.
Yes.
Please, yes. Oh, of course, you can't see where I'm pointing. Jonah, please.
Thanks. Thanks for the talk. Really interesting discussion. I have a few things I was wondering about. So I'm wondering about what the difference is between, what the points of difference are between like Musk and the kind of ideal of agency that he's presenting, and the ideal presented in Analects 1126. Because it seems to me like the problem that Confucius has with what the first three disciples say, and especially Zulu, is not that they're being too intrusive, but because they're being overambitious to start. And the good thing about Zhengxi is that he's not imagining that he'll have the state, have control or power in the state initially, right? All of the rest that, when they hear, oh, if someone trusts you, what you do, they immediately leap to, okay, I'm going to be in this great position, and here's all the good things I can do, right? but Zhengxi, knows that you need to start with, ritual, and start with reordering your dispositions, right, and taking joy in things. But it's not. I don't think it's that. That's where you stop, right? Like um, ideally, you'll go on, you'll develop from that point, you'll master the ritual, and then you'll gain more power in the state as a minister, and then you'll be able to do the great things that the other disciples say they want to do, right? And so, a minister, a Confucian disciple who's employed as a minister and is able to, has all of this power, will maybe act in some more, I suppose, masculine coded ways. They'll have to, at least to the extent of having to identify problems and come up with solutions to them. Maybe they'll take, they'll work with like tact, but that in itself I don't see as incompatible with what's in the text, maybe. So that's just, my first kind of proposal. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, let's start with the basic thing, which is the very question itself. I mean, my impression is, my reading is, or at least I think it's a possible reading, that Confucius's question is not a real question, where Musk's question is a real question. And he expects a real answer. I think Confucius, like I said, is somehow using this formula to allow the students to reveal their character, giving them some space and also to learn, right? To learn from his silence and his smiles. Of course, that's not a very easy lesson, but yeah, he's not famous for giving easy lessons. So yeah, I would say that for the first very basic difference is there, that there is a way to look at this question, what would you do, as not a real question. And that the moment you take it as a real question, you're already off. The moment you start hypothesizing and constructing a situation and imagining your response to it, right? And like building this perfect, let's say, model of the world and your role inside it, you're already off. You have already failed. The moment you start answering the question, you have failed in addressing the question, I think. It's like the moment you start untying the knot, you have failed to untie the knot. I think it's a way that we can understand it like this. So that would be a big difference there. And what else? I mean, again, if we look at these two interviews, like let's say the real one and the pretended one, I do think that there is kind of playfulness there in this dialogue on Kongzi's part, right? And that there is too much seriousness on the part of the three students. And then again, we go back to playfulness with Dian. When Dian gets into the picture, right? With his lute, we go back to somehow to the playfulness we should have stayed with. So yeah, if we look at the two settings, right? Musk's interview and Kongzi's playful kind of interview, we see that they commend exactly the opposite people, right? Like Dian would never be hired by Musk, and Kongzi would not hire Zilu. Zilu is the most, let's say, at least according to our reading, is the most masculine of masculine agencies. So he would not hire Zilu. He's really like not humble, and he doesn't know anything about Li, and he's too rash, right? He's the one who jumps in to answer. So yeah, these would be like major differences, I think, which somehow place them at opposite sides. But on the other hand, this is something, that I did want to touch upon, but I guess I failed to do so. I don't know, I forgot, or is that on the other hand, I don't want to think, or I don't want to propose that like a picture or a reading of Confucian agency as one which is somehow incapable of articulating anything, right? Somehow attached to, I don't know, ineffability, or like a kind of letting go which has no standing, right? So how can we combine this idea of flow, right, and the fluidity and going with things instead of imposing your formula on things, right? How can we combine this idea of fluidity with, of course, a standing, right? If we think about, again, Kong's self-characterization, right? Autobiography, right? Sanshi Li. So what would be the standing that you have? Like, you still have agency, right? You still have something to say about yourself. I mean, he asks them to speak, to say something, right? Something to say about yourself, something to say about the world. But what do you say? And of course, importantly, how do you say it? The how, which is all very much related to Li here, right? How they all like are somehow uncontrollably like jump in and come up with these amazing plans about the world. And of course, some of them also pretend to be humble, whereas they imagine themselves in very powerful positions, right? But they say, "Oh, I will just be a small assistant." So yeah, I don't know if I have answered your question. You want to follow up with something?
Yeah, thanks. That's helpful. I think a couple of thoughts on this. One is, so you said that you're thinking that for Kongzi is kind of proposing a test, giving them a test, right? You're meant to not answer and then put yourself. You're not meant to imagine yourself in a concrete situation and describing what you would do there. But then, if that's so, then what's different about what Zhongxi says, what Dian says at the end, because it seems like he's imagining what he'll do, So that in itself seems innocent to me. It's more something about the nature of what the first three say, namely that it's kind of over, it's like hubristic. That is the problem. The second thing I was thinking is like, so yeah, Kongzi wouldn't hire Zilu, but would Musk, at least that earlier, more sane, grounded version of Musk, would he hire Zilu? I'm inclined to think no, because Zilu is like, he's all bluster, and the concern that Musk is, getting at
I
him when
mean,
he
Musk
was
is also
justifying his. Well, yeah, yeah, Musk is. This is why I specified that version of him, and
the
we can
definition of
debate
bluster.
how deep his pathologies run, but it at least based on what he says in the interview, it seems like he's thinking he wants to test whether people are all talk or not, and so Confucius seems to be kind of doing that as well. He wants to test, the like sincerity of his disciples. So Musk is doing that, but by asking these past focused questions, and he wants to root out the person who will just kind of pretend that they do a good job and so on. And so Liu is kind of that person. Maybe it's just they're getting this information through different questions. Anyway.
Yeah, but yeah, also we have to remember, right, that Kongzi is not hiring anybody. I mean, Kongzi himself is a failure, right? He's a failed HR, like HR manager, right? So, yes, please, James.
Wait, sorry. Can I just jump in just really quickly, Joanne, to just answer the first question? Yeah, sorry, pretending masculinity here. So sorry, just really quick. Another way to answer the first question, right, is to also note that you very famously have like Wu Wei Archi, right? Like whatever, ordering through non-doing, right? Wu Wei was the on the title slide of the presentation.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
from the Analects, right? And then also you have when Confucius is asked about government, right? Then you have the very famous so-called Zhengning, right? The like Jun Jun Chen Chen, right? Like that. If so, you can read this in a very yeah, whatever, Wu Wei or sort of uh I mean, not coming up with specific plans, right? And it seems like the afterwards, the way that this sort of ideal functions for agency or whatever for governance basically, right, is that you might also not know how things were solved actually, right? That when ministers
Yes.
do what ministers are supposed to do, when fathers do as
Exactly.
fathers, blah blah blah, like things will get solved, but you actually won't know, right? I mean, or
Yeah.
you will know, but you'll just know that it's because people were doing what they were supposed to be doing, right? Which I don't think is exactly what Musk is talking about. So that's also another like vein through which we can understand some like key distinctions here, right? Because although it's probably true, right, the idea that Jonah had that this you would develop into having whatever better ideas or more particular sort of governing practices, that those still might not involve not just the hubris, of course, but as much sort of clarity and as high degree of knowing as
Yeah.
someone else might expect. So, James, sorry for interrupting you.
No, not
And
at
it's great
all.
to have you here, James. It's great to have you.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much for the talk. So I have two things, and I'll defer to you about whether to put one or even both aside, as you wish. The first thing, I really liked the aspect of trust that you brought up. And I think that that highlights maybe a bit of a distinction between what Kongs is up to and maybe the modern educational system that I was wondering if you could elaborate on. Namely, Kong's students choose to be with him, right? And like 有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎, right? So like you get people of the same, like seeking out Kongzi from a distance because they believe in his message and so on. So there's kind of a presumptive trust going on there that doesn't exist, for instance, in our contemporary educational system with like mandatory education. For one thing, you don't have to trust the school, you just have to go to school. Or even choosing higher education, oftentimes people's understanding of what they're getting from going to college, getting a bachelor's or a master's is already set in a way that this kind of trust is no longer presumed. So I was wondering what you would say about that and about that those differences in institutional, in institution. And the second thing very quickly is that I was wondering what you would make of the passage at 13.4, where Fan Shi goes to ask about gardening. He said, I'm not as good at, Kongzi says, I'm not a gardener. I'm not as good as a gardener. He has to learn about farming. Kongzi says, I'm not as good as a farmer. Fan Shi goes away and Kongzi says, what use is this, right? If the Shanghao Li, Shanghao Xin, Shanghao Yi, right? The people of the four corners will come to you, right? And of what he says, Yan Yong Jia, right? What use is farming, right? And gardening? This could at least superficially be read as kind of a pushback against the anti-consequentialism claim, right? That the value of this education is precisely in political leadership. It's not to say that farming and gardening is not useful. Of course, we need food, but like there is a consequentialist value to these subjects. So I was wondering what you would make of that.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, as for the educational system and trust, the idea of trust, what can I say? Also, in these times of crisis of expertise, right? Like the role of the educator is somehow threatened, especially now with the like the widespread use of AI and the strengthening of the role of the AI in the classroom, right? This third somehow agent has come into play, and yeah, and that also compromises, I think, trust to the educator, towards the educator. But of course, yeah, to be fair, we have to distinguish between children's education and adult education, right? And Kongzi is mainly like, yeah, he's in the latter category. Yeah, like trust, yeah, trust, and the like I said, the lack of the need for justification, like but not the demand for some kind of, let's say, mental leap, right? Like just trust tradition because I don't think this is the attitude here. Or trust my lesson because I don't think this is the argument, right? Like the non-argument, or not going into this kind of argumentation way of thinking. I think there is still rationality there. There is still some kind of rational nodding to what you perceive, like to whether it is the teaching or whether it is a norm or a ritual, right? Or a inherited way of doing things, or an inherited way of understanding things, right? I think there is a nod there, which is not like devoid of reasoning, or like of there is some kind, you might say there's some kind of common sense mixed up with like trust in the people that came before us. And like, if their ways survive until now, I mean, they must be working, right? But then again, the way that I embody those ways already makes them different, right? I don't have to really impose somehow my agency and change those ways because I presume that I have like better ways to propose. Also, this has to do with ideas about creativity, right? And innovation, and what is innovation, and what is to embody tradition, right? So that would be one thing. And then you said about Kongzi, and basically, yeah, I think this could be connected, this passage about him not, it's about 博学, I think, right? It relates to the idea of 博学, like broad learning, and not turning yourself into a tool by specializing in a particular thing, right? And 成名, like making a name out of yourself, right? Like turning yourself into something which is like somehow, yeah, designated and validated, right, by society. So, which again is an orientation completely at odds with our current educational systems, right? Where this is exactly what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to 成名, to make somebody of yourself, make some name of yourself, right? And to instrumentalize education towards that goal, right? Because this is going to bring you, of course, material benefits and other kinds of honors, right? So yeah, how to bring some kind of some Confucian kind of detachment from the goals, which does not again annul the idea of a goal, or the idea of a vision, right? I mean, Confucius, we talk about that. We talk in these terms. We say Confucius has a vision. So what is a vision, right? Something you imagine which is not there, and which you are like working on by developing like the conditions for that to happen. So how can you do that while at the same time not doing it for that vision, like not doing it for that lead, right? For that benefit. But again, without annulling the importance of the benefit. This would be, I guess, the way to think about it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very inspiring comments. It's time for Michael to start running.
Actually, no, I do have a few more minutes. So if there are more questions, please.
You do? Okay.
Yes, Carlo, please.
Yes, thanks, Dimitra. I really liked your juxtaposition of the two cases, Musk versus Kongze, and you were talking about how we could make a good education. I think this was didactically an excellent tool to use to improve and provoke learning. So that's nice already, I think. One of the other things I was myself thinking around, because I've worked almost all my working life in education, what we could do to improve education. You were talking about how to convince students that learning can be nice and joyful. And I agree with that, but I also have the idea that if you want to provoke learning, it's oftentimes good to make it hard. Looking at Confucius and his students, I think that Kongze is playing the role of the teacher that is hard to get. He keeps his students in the dark about what he expects from them, because it's easy to see that if he was a traditional teacher, the students would have known exactly what he had to say. But he has kept them for perhaps a few years or many years completely in the dark. And that's nice, because that way he can easily judge them on the basis of their answers. But that would imply, you were talking about the intended learning outcomes. There should be no intended learning outcomes, because those trigger the learner just to go for the intended learning outcomes. And of course, it's nice to have intended learning outcomes, but the only thing you learn are things that are not intended, that are unintentional, and that are, as it were, that you get as a gift from contingency. And in a way, this seems to make education easier, because you can say we just leave it to contingency. But especially, I think in higher education for children, I'm not quite sure. I do think that we should perhaps move in that direction. But one of the consequences could very well be that the amount of students that are going to higher education and that pass the judgment of Kongze, for instance, would diminish. Because one of the problems of I'm a fan of education. But if I'm looking, at least in my own country, the amount of people that go to higher education, I also think that it is difficult for higher education to really be higher education. It's more or less not really higher education. And then, as an institution, you would very quickly perhaps come into problems. It's not really a question, but just
Yes.
a bit of musing. But thanks for the talk. Very inspiring. Yeah, great.
Thank you very much. Very quickly, 2 points about the joy, right, that you mentioned, which can bring us to the idea of today's education, right, in this, in the context of this corporate mentality in higher education and corporation institutions, that we are entertainers, right? And that education should be joy. I don't think this is the Confucian view of education, that you should be happy when you're learning. No, I don't think so. I don't think this is what Shuer, the first passage, says. Like, I think it's also some kind of a reminder, like, hey guys, I know you're like struggling, but hey, isn't it also a joy? I mean, don't forget that, right? That there is also joy coming out of this from time to time, when you apply what you have learned, right? And you find a way out. And of course, when you apply what you have learned, I suppose it's going to be in difficult situations that you apply what you have learned, where there is some obstacle, right? So I don't think it's understood in this way. It's not very productive or inspiring to understand it in this way. And this is also something I try to tell my students, that they should not expect ease and enjoyment. But on the other hand, not expect suffering, right? Yeah. That's not the idea either. And the other point you made, Carol, sorry, it's the end of a long day. What was the other point you made? You said about joy, and the second part was...
Well, one of the parts, but you already said something about that. The teacher pays hard to get. That's in fact what you said. It's not. It isn't necessarily joyful, but something joyful can come of it. And
Again,
that would imply
approach-
teaching by contingency instead of by intended learning outcomes.
Yes, this is the point I wanted to make, that we can maybe see this in we can read it in a softer way, right? Not to juxtapose like, oh, it's either contingency or intended learning outcomes, right? Like we can think of the possibility that we can work with intended learning outcomes, right? You can say that the analytics is full of intended learning outcomes, right? Ran, li, yi, zhi. You can take all these as intended learning outcomes. But then I think that the question here would be, how do you cultivate the right attitude towards these outcomes? So that would be somehow a more modest proposal, that we don't get rid of ILOs, but we develop a more healthy attitude to ILOs, and we don't over-rely on ILOs, and we don't act like somehow in this presumptuousness that we saw in the passage, right? So it's about this kind of, being humble, basically, right? And Li, right, in this passage, Confucius is implying Li, and then when Tien like very explicitly describes the Li, I think this is the key here, right? Especially if we think about Li as Li Rang, right? The modern word, right? Li Rang, like letting, this allowing for things to happen, which is in itself, of course, an expression of agency, this letting, right?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dimitra. This has been an incredibly exciting discussion. And yes, we would love to have part 2, and it's really up to you when that would be. We can do that next week or later in the course, but absolutely, this has been wonderful, and we cannot wait for part 2. So thank you so much.
Yeah, let's
Thank you,
do it
guys.
next week if it works, Dimitra.
Absolutely. If it's convenient for you, Dimitra, please feel free to do